and welcome to this evening's webinar. My name is Joy Warmington. I'm CEO of BRAP. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the second webinar that's being hosted by the Equality Republic. The Equality Republic is a growing social movement, really, of people who are ambitious about the future for equalities, want to be part of a social movement that changes the way that we actually deliver equalities practice, very interested in being open and honest and courageous about our role in taking equality forward. And part of that is recognising that many of the things that we do in the name of equality or try to do in the way of equality hasn't necessarily worked and don't make a significant impact. So the Equality Republic movement is about learning, it's about testing and trying things out, it's about evaluating. More importantly, it's about ditching everything that doesn't work and trying to think about how we can collaborate together to create a brighter future. So the Republic is facilitated by BRAP, and Severin, who you can't see, is the administrator for the Republic, and you would have had lots of emails from her talking about getting involved and also in preparation for this webinar. So thank you to Severin and all of the BRAP team for the work that they've done in putting this together. I wanted to just say before I hand over to my colleagues that we're discussing racism tonight, and if you've seen the publicity, we've actually called this seminar "Racism Was For," and we are fortunate to have Carol Campayne from the diversity practice, who's also a sheriff of our Republic, and she will introduce herself in a little while, who's collaborating with us on this seminar today. And we're discussing racism not because it's a topic, but because racism blights lives and it actually takes lives. And that this is something that certainly from my early practice as a facilitator, I was involved in facilitating anti-racist training, and I'm still involved in facilitating anti-racist training. And this is an opportunity to discuss what are we doing as practitioners and how are we doing it, and to think more critically about the methods, the approaches, the thinking that lies behind our anti-racist aspirations. And to help us to do that, I'm going to invite my colleague Diane Rutherford, who's going to compare for this evening. Let me just see if there's anything I've forgotten to tell you. Oh yes, this session is actually recorded, although I think that you're not on, you're not going to be the people in the spotlight that got the shiny foreheads, but just so that you know, the session is actually recorded. Diane's going to go through the logistics of the session, including using the chat and the question and answer function, and so you can see how you can get involved in what we're doing. We have deliberately made this a smaller session. Our launch event, which took place, when did the launch event take place? Somebody's going to tell me when it took place and write it in the chat. The launch event was fabulous, so thank you for everyone that was involved in that. But we wanted to make this a smaller event so that we could really begin to have more discussion and dialogue on this agenda. So we have limited the numbers so that we can potentially facilitate that for happening. Thank you, Ryla. The event took place on the 13th of July. So that's enough from me by way of introduction. I'm now going to hand over to Diane to just do a bit more introduction.
Good evening, everybody, and I hope you can hear me. Okay, so what are we doing this evening? Racism Must Fall. We have organised an event where, in terms of timing, we are hoping to give you opportunities to participate in this. But firstly, you need to know something about how we use this medium. Please make use of the chat, which is here on Zoom, so that you can make use of that to put in questions that you might want to ask. And also perhaps comments that you might want to make, or things that you want to capture in relation to the conversation that we're having, and maybe things you want to pick up later as well. Our chat will be monitored. I think Joy's mentioned that by two of my colleagues. So they might answer people directly as well, because we also have we're using the question and answer function, which is separate from the chat, which you'll see on the bottom of your screen, where also we will try to deal with questions that don't necessarily maybe need to come to the floor, but are things that perhaps people are asking in relation to what we're doing. Let me think that. I suppose I haven't said who I am. My name's Diane Rutherford. I'm part of the BRAC team. I do a lot of the work around learning and development. So I'm an equality practitioner as well, in terms of working with people in different spaces and different organisations to think about what we do in this arena around equalities, and also for a very long time what we are doing in relation to racism and trying to change our world, if you like. My role in this today is I am kind of a participant, but I'm chairing. I'm hoping that I can make sure that I make space for your questions, but also potentially I'm a kind of semi-participant as well, so we'll see how that goes. Let me think, have I missed anything? Okay, so we're going to have both Joy and Carol speak first. So Carol's going to introduce herself in a minute. And then we're going to have some dialogue between us, where we have potentially some questions that kind of start to stimulate this debate. And we're absolutely going to give you an opportunity to put questions in from the floor. So use the chat so you don't lose what it is you want to say. We plan to have a break around 5 to 7. And then after that, we want it to be fairly open in terms of a conversation. So if you put a question in early, try to hold on to it, because it might be something that you can bring in later, because it depends on how active this space is. Okay, so maybe can I ask you, Carol, to introduce yourself? Carol's from Diversity Practice.
Thanks, Diane, and it's great to be here. I've really been looking forward to this conversation, because it's an absolutely critical conversation I don't think that we have as practitioners in this kind of fundamental space. So yes, I'm Carol Campayne, and I'm the director of the Diversity Practice. And I think the word practice says everything about what led to what's kind of led and contributed to my leadership and also to my own practice. Got very frustrated in the talking about diversity and inclusion and not making that a reality, and not making that a reality particularly for women, and also importantly for Black, Asian and ethnically diverse leaders. And so we're in the business of kind of creating transformational real change that really challenges the status quo and shifts mindsets. We do that through leadership development, executive coaching, and organizational development too. I'm even more excited because I'm a sheriff, and my role as sheriff is to recognize that, we are here today, and when we look at the state of the nation, when it comes to race, we were fooled into thinking, maybe this time last year, that we were making progress. And the reality is, as we now know, that we weren't making any progress at all. And that has challenged all of us, and particularly with regards to BRAC, who've created this unique opportunity to shift and change that. So in a few years' time, we can look, and the status quo, we will have evidence that things have shifted and changed. And my role is to whip that into shape as a sheriff, is to hold the Republic to account from not being lured into that magnet of the comfort zone and the status quo. So that's me, the Diversity Practice, and my role as sheriff, and looking forward to the conversation we're about to have. I'm going to pass back to Diane.
Okay, thank you for that, Carol. before we continue, I understand my camera's a bit fuzzy, but I think that might be the internet connection, so I apologize for that. It's kind of quite good too, but there we are. Okay, okay then. So there's a couple of things that I want to make sure that we're kind of clear about. So I've mentioned using the Q&A for direct questions to the panel, but there are also some things we need to set our stall out a little bit in terms of how we're doing this. So if you like, we have some ground rules, not just about how we're going to interact with the panel, but also how we're hoping you're going to interact with us on the Q&A. And to begin with, actually, what we want to create is an open space for people to have dialogue. So we're not in a competition, and we're really very, very clear about that. That's some of what has been a problem in the past. We want to find ways that we can be progressive, but we also think that one of the things that's been missing here is a bit of curiosity, a bit of the ability to step in and have an open, curious debate, and that's where we're going as well. So if you're used to, you know, that Twitter space where you get a bit rough, you're in the wrong place. Okay, so we're really trying to have a bit of thinking about how we interact with each other. And also recognize that we're really focused on trying to think about anti-racist practice and what might we make a world that's different. And you know, you'll see as we have our conversation. Now, as I say that, I recognize that one of the things that we start to have a little bit of a I don't know, what would you call it? Maybe a fight about is terminology. And I want to kind of be sort of very clear about where we stand on some of this stuff, because we know that it's bitterly contested. Am I BME? Am I BAME? Am I this new BIPOC one? Etc., etc. It's not settled, and we're not going to settle it here. And also, in some respects, it can be a little bit like low-hanging fruit. We don't want to dwell on there. We know there's an important debate to be had, but that's not potentially what we're doing here. We're trying to figure out something where we step a little bit past some of that, knowing that it's still a place where some conversation needs to be had. But we do need to define racism. And people are going to have issue with that, I define it here, but you know, I think just lean into it a little bit. When we're talking about racism here, we're talking about the hierarchy that's been created, that is focused on this, the idea that we have different races determined by potentially people's skin color, their physical features, and then we also extrapolate that to mean that they have certain capabilities or things that they don't do well, spaces that they should be in, that we attribute value to people based on their skin color and this notion of race. And the reason I'm saying that it's a notion of race is one of the things we are absolutely not contesting is that race does not exist as a biological reality. We use the terminology because socially it's live and it's real. It'd be nice one day that we can just be like the cats where there's ginger ones and whatever, and we just call them all cats. But basically we're saying that we acknowledge that race doesn't exist, racism does. And that racism is about power and prejudice interacting, resulting in people being put at the bottom of the pile and others being elevated, and it's about skin color, heritage, etc. Okay? And I'm happy for my other panel members, Joy and Carol, if you think there's, oh, she missed something there, then please do, like, fix it. Okay? Okay then, let me think. Have I missed anything before we go on? But this is a very political space and we recognize that, and we're actually stepping into that with our eyes open. Okay, so are you both happy for me to start the interrogation? Okay then, so I have a question. We say we want to have an honest, open debate. We're trying to be non-judgmental about our conversation as equality practitioners. And we have called this session, Racism Must Fall. And so my first question, and maybe I'll ask you, Carol, is racism must fall? Why? How would we do this? Why?
Love the why. I love the why question. I mean, it's a big and it's a bold question. But I think you began to allude to it earlier on. And one of the things that you asked as well, Diane, is there something that's missing? It must fall because, you know, we did say that racism is not a topic, it is a blight. And it takes and it costs lives. And so from that point of view, it has no place in a humane society. I also think that when we talk about the impact of racism and, you know, how I define it in my head, I mean, I talk about racism as a toxin. It's a toxic disease that has blighted our society, that dehumanizes people on the basis of this social construct called race. And so if it was a social construct that created it and has had this colossal negative impact on the world, then it's a social construct that we as society can deconstruct. And we can absolutely and have to shift and have to change. It's just, it's always been a non-negotiable. Now more so, now more than ever. I never want to watch a black man being murdered on my television screen just because of the color of his skin, and people abusing power in that way. So I get kind of quite angry in a good way about this, because it fires up purpose. So that's why it must die, not just fall, but die.
Okay, thank you, Carol. I'm not going to ask Joy the very same question. I'm going to kind of go on from that. And actually, so Carol's saying it must die, it's time, we need to really be able to be eliminating this. So I reckon that we can do it through non-racist means. What do you think?
Is that to Joy? Yeah.
Yes, to Joy. Sorry, you're on mute, Joy.
I wanted it to be Carol again, actually, because I know this is a hard one. But I think that we have to understand that being not racist is not a thing. So it's a neutral. It's a position that appears to describe neutrality, but it's not neutral. It's actually not being very active. It's actually about colluding with the status quo, because really not contributing to a racist culture is by default benefiting from it, and by benefiting from it you are contributing to racism. So it's not a position that I would advocate. I think that the bigger challenge for most people is to understand what being not racist is and what being anti-racist is, because most people actually would say, oh, I'm not a racist because I don't call out names to people in the street. I don't deliberately set out to abuse people who are racialized as black. This is not the stuff that I do on a daily basis. And I think they find it very hard, most people, to then think, well, what is it that I do? And I think that's the bit of learning that requires a lot of skill, a lot of understanding, a lot of intervention, because between those 2 points, I think is the real shift towards understanding how to be an anti-racist and joining a movement around being anti-racist as opposed to being non-racist.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay then. So, I mean, this is a question for either one of you then. So what if I top out at the non-racist space? That's an edge for me, and it's enough for me. What is it that I'm moving towards what am I not moving towards that you are expecting me to move towards? you know, the non-racist space really I'm burning.
Mm-hmm. I think in terms of you know, and I'm going to build on what Joy said about the not racist space where you might be burning, as you said. In that not racist space, and I'm not racist, I get to define, I'm not racist actually. And so I'm able to, by saying that, validate that in some way. And that means that, you know, that gives the opportunity not to be challenged. So if I say that I'm not racist, you have to believe that I am not racist. And that's particularly, I think, quite dangerous in some ways, if you haven't had the lived experience of being racialized in any particular way. And you know, we hear this all the time by people who are in very privileged and very powerful situations and positions rather. And so in terms of what we want to move you towards, it is moving you towards a place where you're able to actually own where you are, and what your position is with regards to anti-racism. It's moving you towards a place where you can articulate, and in terms of your mindset and your behaviors, they demonstrate that you are anti-racist. It's also moving you, as I said, kind of back to a place where you recognize that this self-proclaimed position of I'm not racist is a non-position, and it is collusion. And so we know that as anti-racist practitioners, and that's what we're talking about, we can't force that. We can't tell you, we can't teach you how to be. That is something that at an individual level you must own. But at the end of that kind of engagement, you know where you stand. And that's what we want to move you towards in kind of, in my head, as a first step. It is about that uncovering of, okay, this is where I am. And we always believe that you're at choice, right? Leaders are always at choice. And so at that point, you know, and you're able to choose to stay there or to move to a different place.
Okay, thank you. So then, what does it look like then if I'm an anti-racist? What's that going to look like? What are the kinds of things that I'm going to do? What's the commitment that we're talking about that means that racism will fall? And perhaps Joy, you could deal with that.
Yeah, I suppose the bit with the terminology thing being non-racist and anti-racist is for me, there's an ability to recognise the systemic issues, the systemic nature of racism that's not being expressed when you say that I'm not racist, that you understand is there in heaps when you say that you're anti-racist. And by systemic issues, what you're talking about here is dismantling, challenging the values, the structures, the behaviours that perpetuate racism. And that's a lot of effort. I'm not saying that even I do it every day of every week. You know, sometimes you just have to hold your hands up and say that you're a bit tired. But actually, understanding that this is a systemic issue and understanding that if you don't step out of it, you're in it, is really the bit that is anti-racism. And it's not a difficult, it's totally a difficult thing to do, because it is, when you're immersed in a treacle of the world like we are, you can really only step out of it for moments. And actually dismantling the structures, changing our history, changing our education system, thinking more critically about what we see around us in the media, really touching every part of the society that we live in. That's going to take change. Already we're already another generation of children have been conditioned into racism. So, you know, this is going to be a long-term change, and it's got to be a consistent thing. Because if we can't do it consistently and do it at a scale, then we're not necessarily going to be able to notice the impact that we want to notice at the end of the day. So it's got to be there in us in a way that's both passionate, that can begin to really understand how we can touch the things around us and make that happen first. Because actually the active point of, you know, my interactions, what I do on an everyday basis, can make a huge difference. And I think that's really what we're trying to do when we're talking about helping people to understand what it is to be anti-racist.
Okay. So for both of you then, it sounds like, you know, is this a stretch for white people? Can they do it?
I think it, you know, is it a stretch? Can white people do it? I actually think that white people can. I think we all can. You know, I think there's a place where we all have our place in deconstructing the system. And I'm kind of equally clear that when we think about it in, you know, in the UK context, that it is the majority's role, it is their responsibility to deconstruct to deconstruct systemic racism. And that's one of the things, you know, we're talking about in terms of the anti-racist practitioner, who you need to be, what you need to do, how you bring about change at that systemic level. And that's one of the things that I think has been a real distraction, that historically before now, the focus was very much on that deficit model. Well, you need to fix the Black community to fit into a particular paradigm that they're actually not part of. And, you know, Toni Morrison says that, you know, racism is a distraction. It is absolutely a distraction. There'll always be one other thing. And so I think it is the responsibility of white majority to own this in a very different way. And we as anti-racist practitioners facilitate that shift. You know, that's our role, to facilitate, to uncover, to support in some ways. But I don't think that it is our job to do that, because I think that's one of the reasons why we're still where we are, and why, as Joy was saying, our children are now still being born into, you know, this racialized world, because the focus has been often left to fixing that community. And I now think that in this new paradigm of the Equality Republic, the focus needs to shift again. But I absolutely do think that white people are more than capable of responding to this agenda. But it's about will, and it's about power, and it's about, you know, the extent to which they are willing to acknowledge that and shift the power base.
Okay then, so I want to kind of move on a little bit from what Carol just said, and to ask you this then, Joy. So if we're saying yes, white people can, and that we're saying that they need the will and the power, they have the power, etc., then why don't they? You're on mute.
I am. Your question tickled me. You know, if we knew that, Diane, I think we could be quite rich here, couldn't we? There's lots of reasons, and you can contribute to this as well. I mean, one of the things on I suppose on the complete side of you know, on the most basic scale that you could think about this on, I think one of the issues is that people don't recognise it. They don't recognise the world has been created in the way it has. They don't recognise that they have any benefit from it. They don't recognise any responsibility for it, either to eradicate racism or their responsibility in perpetuating it. So that's the one end of the scale. On the other end of the scale, and there's lots of incremental bits in between, I would say that racism is tied up with the economic structures of this society, the power structures of many societies, including this one. And at a really basic level, if I promote someone that looks like you, Diane, it means that one of mine won't get in. And so there's a real unwillingness to give up power, other than at a very tokenistic level. How many do we need around the table to satisfy? How many, let's set up a Black support network. I'm not criticizing networks. I'm just saying that there are things that are done which prop up a system and are not interested in dismantling a system. So it becomes very, very tiring. I think the other thing is that I don't think there's enough courage out there. So we're kind of tussling between how do we find some really purposeful things to do that address systemic change, recognizing that we don't have the power that's going to make people do the things that they need to do to address systemic change. So you're kind of pussyfooting around all the time, trying to enable people to recognize the benefit of something when they absolutely don't recognize the benefit of it. And they're only willing to do a 1 or a 2, when actually what you really need them to do is a 4, a 5, a 6, and a 7. So it's kind of really tied up, and it's really tightly bound. So it becomes easy to take it off the table, and easy for it to be dismissed, and easy, I think, to be placated. I think we go away, we run away. So, it's like with Obama, oh, look, we've got one of those now, everything's sorted, So I think we're not realizing what whole-scale systemic change means, and the kind of disruption that would need to be created for that to happen, and the kind of interventions that need that to happen as well.
I also think, it's a very kind of, at a very fundamental level, behind not recognizing it and not having the courage, I think there's also something about, the courage to really accept, what your own biases are and how you see, the world. How do white people really see Black people? I mean, we kind of go back historically to, to slavery and to colonialism, and that tells a very powerful narrative. And that is embedded really deeply into the psyche of white majority. I'm not saying generally or everyone, but certainly that is in the psyche, the kind of, I am more than, we are knowers, you are not. We have conquered, you were conquered. And that is kind of, and so to be able to shift to, not seeing me as a Black woman in that guise, but as an equal, right? Actually, as an equal to you, and actually in many cases, someone who adds even more value, who is of more, and so on and so forth, doesn't enter in that. That's the kind of psyche that, as practitioners, we are skillfully trying to, again, coming back to that word, trying to deconstruct.
Okay, thank you. As you're both talking, actually, one of the things I was thinking about was how we talk a lot about the impact of racism on people that are racialized as Black, and I'm talking Black in the political sense, as in people of color. And yes, all these terms are coming out, but it's going to have to live with them for a bit. But we don't talk about, we've just alluded to it, but we don't expose as much that actually, if you're white, there's damage that's gone on if you really believe this thing called racism and you live it. Yeah, that you are damaged. This cognitive dissonance, that you're only seeing a part of the world, you think you're in all of it, but you're not. You said some things about, you think you're there's a power dynamic going on, but actually there's the idea that you've got the power, but you need courage to talk about racism. It's really interesting, isn't it? Because it seems like something of a contradiction. And I just wanted to try to think about that. Why don't people recognize the system? and I hear one of the things you're saying is because people benefit from it.
Yeah.
And the benefit is so huge, is so seductive, that it's pretty okay to sit on George Floyd's neck.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's and not see a person or go, what did he do? So I'm trying to figure out, as equality practitioners then, how do we get people to that place? And I'm not saying it's our responsibility, but how do we get to that place where this thing, I don't know, the covers come off? I don't know, the whole world is seeing, not just the world that you benefit from. That's a hard question, I think. But you're hard women, come on.
Joy, Joy, you have a go, then I can
Oh, okay. I mean, I think it links to what Carol was saying about the worldview, the way that we live in this world that isn't the real world, and we occupy it and we think it's real, and then we have little glimpses of it, little bits of data, statistics, people coming to our door that tell us a little bit about another worldview. And what we haven't yet been able to do, I think, or is more difficult to do, because I think some of us have been able to do this stuff, is to really get hold of someone who is who has some opportunity and power to impact on change, and do some of the things with them that they themselves can feel disrupted, and to step outside of that this world long enough to realize that they can be somewhere else. So I think that, I'm not saying it's easy, but I also think that we waste a lot of time and a lot of effort doing things that don't really matter and don't change the status quo. I also realize there's some really good reasons for that. Not only are we talking sometimes about people who are not interested, a lot of the times people are not interested because, you know, race is not my issue. If I'm a white person, it's your issue over there. So we're constantly in that battle of trying to help people to recognize that this is something they should be interested in. And increasingly, I think that the lived experience, tell me your story thing isn't necessarily doing it, and it becomes really exhausting, I think, to be trying to convince people that racism exists. So I think the trick is, if there is a trick, is to work on the whiteness bit. It's got to be to work on the whiteness bit. It's got to be to help more white people recognize that they're in this suit. Somebody I know once gave me a book to read called The Miner's Canary, and I thought that was a fascinating book. And you know, the analogy is that when we did have a mining industry, that people used to take a canary in a cage down into the mine, so that when there was a gas leak, the canary would suffocate, would be in distress first, and it would allow people then enough time to get out of the mine. And I think that that's really what racism is. There are people here who are dying first, we're suffocating first, but we're all dying of it. And, you know, it's your point, Diane. I think white people, some white people don't recognize, and whiteness, I'm not talking about individual white people, but the white, you know, our white world, our white ideology doesn't recognize that it is dying from it. You know, you could talk about the environmental movement, about how we're using up all the resources, but we don't recognize that the world is dying from it. And it could there's a similar analogy here, that actually we're all dying from it. It's just that some people are dying much quicker, but we all are absolutely dying from it.
Yeah, thank you, Joy. It'd be good to find out whether so that I don't hog all this time as well. I can see the chat is quite active. Do we have any questions for the panel from participants from the floor at all?
Hi, yeah. Can everyone hear me?
We can.
Brilliant. Okay. So we've had quite a few questions about the conversation that's just happened around whiteness. So there's 3 questions. I'll read them all out. The first is from Mark, and he's asking, do you think that white people unpicking their whiteness is an act of anti-racism, or is it just a narcissistic way of putting themselves front and center? So we've touched upon that, but I don't know if you want to expand. Someone else has asked, why would white people want to change the status quo when they're benefiting from it? And then Julian's asked, when's it a good idea to have white people and Black and BME people do their work separately? And when is it best when they work together? So there's some other questions as well, but if we perhaps talk about that those whiteness ones first.
That's good, thank you. I mean, I've got a quick answer to the last one, when to separate and when to work together. When to separate is when it gets fisticuffs. Just I'll throw that in. Because sometimes actually, I understand, I've seen with my own experience of different settings that we're in, that actually there's quite a lot of containment that I as a Black person have to engage in, not to rough some people up. I can't put it in a more gentle way than that. But let's see what Joy and Carol think of those. So where do you want to go in terms of, is unpicking whiteness, anti-racism, or is it centering yourself? Why would white people want to change when the benefits are so fantastic? And when we separate or work together? Anywhere you like.
So I'd like to kind of kick off with the, is it a narcissistic way to focus on whiteness and so we kind of end up in that place where we're centering whiteness again, and that can be a distraction in and of it, in and of itself. I think one of the things that has become clear to me over over 20 years of doing this is that to an extent we've been asking white leaders in organizations to do sometimes a thing that's not realistic for them. How can I value your difference as a Black man, Black woman across intersectionality when I've never explored what it means to be white? I've never explored my own identity. And in not doing that, it becomes a kind of, it becomes kind of almost this kind of evangelical kind of gift that I am giving to you. So I realize you're suffering. What can I do? And we continue to perpetuate. There's a really great article called White Unconsciousness, and when you're part of a majority, you don't see that. So whenever I'm in a Black country, be that Nigeria, Barbados, wherever else, I'm not thinking about my race. And so to the extent to which we give and provide spaces, safe spaces, challenging spaces for white people to really explore, what does it mean to be white? What does it mean to be male? What does it mean to be able-bodied? To really look at that, and what privilege might that afford? And I think about privilege as an unearned kind of privilege. It's a privilege that's kind of just there. It's not something that has been manufactured or that you have built. Then I think that changes and shifts the paradigm, because then we're in a position where we are all acknowledging and stepping into and working with our own unique differences. And if race is a social construct, as we've agreed, then it's as equally important for me to explore that as it is my white counterpart.
Okay, so thank you, Carol. And what you're saying actually is that race doesn't belong to Black people.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah, it wouldn't exist if it wasn't in that opposition to white. So actually, the dismantling of it involves us all doing our work. Yeah.
I suppose one of the things I would add to that, Diane, is that part of the challenge, and I don't know how we come over this, because I totally agree with you. Race belongs to all of us. Is that often when white people get into this stuff of working with whiteness, I'm not sure it results in and more anti-racist individual. I don't know what this anti-racist individual is, by the way. I often wonder about that being a bit of a myth as well. But I'm not sure whether there needs to be a way of you being able to test that the work that you've done on yourself is making the difference that you think it's making. It's almost like getting dressed without a mirror. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in some respects, you need the mirror. Yes, you need to learn how to get dressed yourself. You need to do the work, but you need to have some way of understanding how that work's landed so that you know that what you're doing is actually making a difference.
But there's so many things that interfere with that, even that perspective. You know, who do you see when you look in the mirror? There's so many unconscious ways that that whole thing about that cognitive dissonance bit that takes place. And I do think that that's where, as practitioners, that's where our facilitation of that process becomes really critical. Because really, to be honest, I want to see the good bits in me, right? I judge myself by how I view myself. And not necessarily by my shadow, which has that negative, you know, which has that negative impact. So I think it's kind of sitting in front of that mirror and staying long enough and being courageous enough and reflexive enough to absorb what's really there, and not come away from it going. And I think that's the other thing about this journey that we're on when it comes to whiteness, is that you immediately get into the space of, I don't want to talk about it because I'm afraid. I'm so afraid, I'm full of fear. You know, it makes me feel wrong. It makes me feel bad. I'm a bad person. So therefore I don't want to do that. And so I'm going to shut this down. And so how do we as practitioners move again beyond that?
A really important question also, because as a practitioner, quite often with a group, you're trying to maneuver around a whole load of things, including people's egos and not wanting to heap shame or distress on people because you want to keep them with you. You know, all of navigating that, but recognizing that actually to bring people into that uncomfortable space is exactly where light's going to shine a bit more. And I can see that I've had experience of that being very, very difficult, very difficult.
And debilitating as well. So you just go, and particularly as a Black practitioner, when that's happened to me historically, I'm debilitated, I lose my voice, and it's end of, and I end up being the caretaker for the shame and the fear, and, you know, and again, when we're looking at what this looks like today, it's how do we respond to that differently? Just let people own their emotion and be curious about that.
I'm trying to be a bit helpful about the time, Diane, but I suppose one of the things I was going to say is that we often don't help people to see themselves. So we make it very hard for people to say what they believe, regardless of whether or not we believe it, or it's on message, or it's political. So we shut that down before they've even had a chance to raise it. And what that then means is that, and I'm not trying to get into any arguments about freedom of speech around, you know, I'm not saying that, you know, people should be writing racist graffiti all over the place. It's just that if we can't encourage people to understand and hear how they think and what they believe, then I don't know whether we can tap into some of the things we need to do to support them to understand why they think it and why they believe it. Because one of the things I think is really important is recognizing that this is systemic, that actually some of this stuff isn't there because, you know, it was part of original thought. Some of this stuff is there because it has been developed by our society for you to believe that stuff. So one of the ways out of this is for people to recognize that, you know, some of the thoughts that they have are part of a construct of our society to encourage racism to exist, and actually being in a position where you can you can help people to uncover some of that thought process is actually a really important facilitative skill, in my view.
Okay, I am noticing the time as well, and I'm thinking that we need to offer people opportunity to break. And I guess what we're hearing there is that the idea that we're talking about a redesigning of our society with the recognition that it's being deliberately designed in the way in which we inhabit it now. And so we're needing to think as anti-racist practitioners, and this thing around anti-racism, how do we deliberately push over racism and step into something that might be more beneficial to everybody, with people screaming and shouting about it. This is a good moment, I think, to take a break. Is that okay? Rather than try and squeeze another question in. And can we say that we come back together at 7 o'clock? Is that all right? Well, it doesn't matter if it's all right for everyone. We're coming back together at 7 o'clock. Okay. Okay. So you don't have to log out to be able to step away and have a drink, etc. So 7 o'clock, everyone. Thank you. Okay, so I hope everyone's back. Very quick break, but that's how it is. So in the last hour, it'd be really great, given where we've been so far, where we've talked about what we think anti-racism means, why a non-racist approach isn't good enough, what we're thinking around the role of white people, whiteness, and how we work together, etc. I know that there's some activity in terms of people wanting to ask questions. So what we thought we'd do is give you an opportunity to ask your question in person. And I know that one of the first people who's interested in asking a question is Cheryl. So are you happy to come on, either on screen or audio, and put your question? Is that all right?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can.
Brilliant.
Yes, I can hear you, thanks.
So my question, panel, is about all of the space that gets taken up with the discussions about labels and terminology, and sometimes it frustrates me, and other times I feel like it's a really important site of discussion and exploration and definition. But I think there's a lot more going on under the surface of that debate, and we can get really caught up in it. And I was just curious about your thoughts about what you feel is going on under the surface when the surface conversation is all about what we're calling each other today.
Thank you, Cheryl. I'm happy to go with either Carol or Joy, whoever's ready to speak.
Well, I think it's it's a distraction in a way. It's a huge distraction. I mean, race is politicized. The labeling of racialized people is wholly politicized, and I understand that people might want to take control of who they are and their own identity. But that has got to a place really where there are a number of discussion forums that I've seen where things are almost abusive. I'm not sure whether we're realizing that we're playing out some of that abuse on each other. I'm not sure that we realize that we're using some of the same things that we experience and passing them on to other people who basically face the same kind of racism that we experience. So it's complex. I'm fed up of saying it's complex actually, but it can be a huge distraction.
Thank you. Carol, you're on mute.
Yes, I am. I was having a full conversation with myself there, getting excited. It is, you know, I think Cheryl, you answered the question. It is a real distraction, and what's going on beneath it. There's a really good friend of mine, And she said this to me once, Audrey Campbell. She said, you know, we all drink the same dirty water. And so if we think about the way that we overcomplicate these conversations and we almost turn it in, you know, conversations in and of themselves become inaccessible, and we stop focusing on the real thing and we focus on the thing that isn't as critical and might not be as important. And I think the important thing is for us to really focus on, you know, again, on the outcome. But to Joy's point, it is a real distraction, and there are many ways in which, even as anti-racist practitioners, we have drunk that water, swallowed it, and in part can be lured into having those same conversations. That kind of working in higher education, we start the conversation about, you know, let's say about race, we'd end up in a conversation about gender, then we'd end up in a conversation about, and what is the statistical significance of? And all the time distracting us from the real issue. So absolutely agree. And it's important for us to know how we've internalized some of the ways in which we evaluate things, focus on things as well.
Although having said all that, I just think there's some terms that absolutely need to be ripped up.
Sure.
Yeah, and I understand that people are challenged around terminology, and I think that terminology could be learned and better understood. I think rather than just mimicking things that we've heard, we ought to think a little bit more critically about why names have changed, what that means politically, whether it really helps us to understand each other more. I absolutely don't think that that any type of, so I'm just noticing somebody that says we need to be sure about, we're talking about the same thing. And I think that that's triggered me to think that one of the things that's going on when we talk about language is our preoccupation with difference. So we're really interested in making ourselves different. We're interested in not thinking about racism as a unified fight, in my view.
Thank you. I think there's a back and forth thing that goes on around language as well, isn't there? Because actually does it precede a change in behavior, or does it encourage it? Does it precede a change in attitude, or does it encourage it? And actually there isn't always evidence that the language is the thing that's made the difference. So you can call me the thing I like and still treat me badly. Yeah. So it doesn't, you know, it hasn't delivered. So, but we aren't in anywhere, and I'm not hearing any of us say that it isn't important, but I'm kind of saying it takes up all the air, and maybe there's, in the meantime, under the surface, people get to be happily playing the way that they always have done. We don't change things. So thanks for that question, Cheryl. I think we have a couple more.
Yeah, so still on the topic of whiteness, there's a couple of questions that have come in from Cully and Carol. So Cully wants to know, how do we deal with the backlash of white people trying to justify their beliefs after, say, Black Lives Matters? And Carol's asking a similar question. So she wants to know how she can have conversations with her family and friends who always try and fall back and sort of say that they're not racist. And she points out that actually it's really difficult to have these conversations without them getting upset, frustrated and angry. And also difficult for her to have the conversations without her getting upset, frustrated and angry. So any kind of ideas on that?
Very good question. We sometimes forget about the big piece that emotion plays in this, for sure. Who would like to take that?
So do you want to have a go? Or I'm happy to. Anyway.
No, I don't mind really. So I think we kind of answered this, although I think it's really much more difficult and complex with relations and families, which is that somewhere in that backlash is all of the stuff that we've already spoken about. It's the privilege, it's the avoidance, it's the all of the things that get in the way. But also within that is the roots to unlock people's understanding of their own belief system if you can facilitate it well. And I think that's the challenge, that it isn't just about letting people go on, it's about, you know, trying to get to a place where that can be a facilitated conversation. It's difficult to do that en masse, because you've got, you know, loads of people coming up, or you've got a statement on a television, or you've got a you know, something that you're reading. It's how do we actually help people to interact with their beliefs, and that needs a more personal thing. I think it's really difficult to do it with family and with friends. I think you know I've lost friends that I thought I had as friends on the basis of trying to have some of these difficult conversations, because you kind of have to make choices. It's like, you know, like many people, I'm sure, have lots of skills, and then when you try and do it with your partner or something, you kind of forget everything you ever knew about mediation and counselling and conflict, and all you want to do is to wrap your hands around their neck and shake them. So I think it's quite difficult, I think, to do some of this stuff with family and friends and do it in ways that are productive. You might have to incrementally show them things. You might have to be very clear about phrases they should say and things they shouldn't say. I know for us in a mixed heritage family, that's what we've had to be able to do. We've had to point out, you know, I don't care why you think that's the way it is, but when you come to this house, this is how I want you to call my children. This is how, you know, so there's some stuff you can do to mitigate some of that, I think.
Yeah. I mean, in addition, one of the words that I think we've used quite often is, you know, and you talked about it, Joy, that racism is a unified fight. And so it is a fight, and we've got to be prepared for, you know, we've got to, in some senses, that whole thing about really being prepared for that fight, whether that emerges in the workplace or that emerges at home, and putting some boundaries in place. There's a lot of self-care that goes into that, you know, as well, because it is, you know, it's very emotive, particularly, you know, if you are of a particular background as well. So I think really putting those specific barriers in place and recognizing that it is a bit, it's like, it is warfare. And so kind of how prepared are you? What kit do you actually need? What protective gear do you need? How do you, you know, how do you take other people's perspectives into consideration and are able to really sit with that particular perspective? What are the no-go, you know, what are the no-go areas, and your own stop signs? So there's a lot of kind of mastery that's involved in that process as well. I've seen too many of us jump into that particular ring and kind of sit there for round 100 without stepping back and putting those things in place.
Thank you both. Thank you. I'm hearing a thing also around attitude and behavior, and that's you have to draw your lines, and those lines aren't necessarily something you don't draw. You reserve for people outside of your family. There are also lines that you can draw within your family so people know where you stand. And then you also, I think that what sometimes we have is that family deliberately provoke because they know what the buttons are and they know what the reaction is going to be. So there isn't an interest and intention to change, just to fire you up. So that's the interesting thing. Do we have another question? Yes.
Yeah, so just on that topic of having difficult conversations, we've had an anonymous question, which is asking basically, how do you have these conversations with Black people? Is it any different? So this questioner says she or he knows a lot of Black people who don't like the victimization narrative around something like Black Lives Matters. So just interested in the panel's take around how to have those conversations. And then, I mean, if you already feel you've kind of spoken about that, we've got a new set of questions from Sunny and Rajan, which are to do with the trauma around racism. So Rajan says he's only just realized the extent of the trauma he's experienced having to deal with racism on a day-to-day basis. And also, you know, the kind of impact of his migrant parents' journey around racism. And Sunny has said, how do we even start to deal with the historical and future trauma caused as a result of racial injustices? So kind of two sets of questions there.
I mean, I think Sunny, raises a really important point around the traumatic impact of racism, which, and I certainly align with that, which to some extent, up until kind of recently for me, was normalized. There's a way in which that trauma became an everyday thing that one was responding to. And that has a huge impact on stress levels. We've seen that racism does have an impact on, our health, does have an impact on our mental well-being, and how important it is to do everything that you would do having suffered a trauma. And for me, sometimes that is about getting help and getting the help that, that I actually need to talk through what that impact actually looks like. But I also think that, Sunny, you've labeled it as trauma, because again, I think that is a label that isn't often associated with what we have experienced with regards to racism. I think kind of starting with that level of self-care is absolutely critical, and recognizing that we can't normalize oppression. We can't just absorb that as being part of our everyday experience. And so how do you mitigate that? And I know that following Black Lives Matter, we've seen, certainly in the United States, lots of Black African Americans using joy as a form of resistance, deliberately and intentionally finding places of rest and recuperation and safe spaces to talk and share as well.
Thanks, Karen. Very important. Were you speaking, Joy?
I know, I'm good. I was actually thinking about that question that someone raised around Black Lives Matter, and not actually feeling wanting to be labelled as a victim.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a really interesting question, because I think it brings out the other challenge that we have with this, which is that we're not all blobs. So how do you address racism without taking people's individual identities and beliefs off the table? And I think that's something that if racism is about freeing people to be the human beings we already know that we are, and helping people to make choices and decisions that are not racialized, then I think there's always this challenge when we do things collectively and people say, I don't want to be involved in this, I want to be outside of that. And of course that is their choice. Yeah. And I think that's always, it's not we can't just assume that everybody thinks the same way, because actually we're doing the same kind of stuff that we've had done to us for centuries.
Thank you. So we're saying that there's a journey that different people are on, and actually it doesn't mean that we possibly won't end up in a space that we can manage and that is positive for us. And there's a real habit actually of seeing people who are racialized as Black as a blob, all want the same thing in the same way, going to fight in the same way, going to characterize stuff in the same way. And clearly we wouldn't say that about white people.
No.
So,
I'm also interested, Diane, if I may.
Of course.
This link between, let's take Black Lives Matter as a movement and victimization, something that I really want to be, I think, an important thing to explore. So when, in terms of Black Lives Movement as a movement, are standing up to protect the rights of Black people who have been brutalized and murdered, and we can go on, we know that narrative. I'm interested and curious about how is that portraying, if that's the evidence, how is that portraying Black people as helpless victims, which I think sometimes there is that kind of connotation that is made. So when I'm
Absolutely. Yeah.
courageous people who are taking a stand, they are being advocates for change. I'm not saying people that are victims that can't help themselves. But and it's just something I think worth exploring, because there's often an association between two things.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you, Carol. Yeah.
What do we think victim means?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it needs a bit more interrogation. Yeah, absolutely. So and I think with a lot of the questions, there's more, isn't there? There's a surface, and then beneath that, there's a lot more that we've been at this racism stuff a long time. So actually, there's layers and depths to this stuff that we need to talk about, and that's a demonstration of that. I think there's another question.
There is. Before we move on, though, just underneath Rajan's question, there was a slightly different point. So Rajan was saying that he's an activist and he wants to support people. So he's actually called the panel experts, and he's wondering how he can support the experts. But he wants to know as well, is there a danger of him trying to be too courageous too soon? So I think there's that element of it. And connected with that, there's another question asked anonymously, which is that, do you ever get tired of fighting? And if so, how do you pick yourself up when that happens?
I think, so I was going to weigh in there. I don't know whether there's a danger of being too courageous too soon. I think that I remember taking my children on things and I'm not sure they knew what they were marching for, actually. They were just going with mommy and being part of things. But I think that the challenge was always going to be the pushback, which leads to the second question, which is how do you avoid being tired, and how do you recognise gains in this agenda when so much of what you committed your life to actually doesn't appear to have made any real difference or impact to people at all. So there's something about how do you have hope, how do you get up every day with a bit of a belief that something's going to shift today, because I think if I couldn't do that, I don't think I could do this role. I couldn't do this work, because I have to believe that something's going to change. I cannot sit at this point of fatalism. I can't do it for myself. I can't do it for my children, and I definitely can't do it for my grandchildren. So I think there's a need to find something that can bolster you, and recognize that you don't have to stand up all the time. I once met one of the most brilliant activists in London. It was fantastic to meet with her, and she was telling me that there are times when you have to sit down, times when you know you can't stand up and do every battle. So I think there is a little bit about understanding that as well. I mean, actually the hardest thing is to sit down. Sometimes I sit in meetings and I go, right, Joy, don't say anything, don't say anything, don't say anything. And then suddenly it'll come out. And I don't really mean it to. So I think it's sometimes difficult to kind of contain the passion.
But I think you can't contain that passion, Joy, and I'm in that same place. There's so many times I've been biting my tongue to the point it's almost bleeding, and you kind of have to, and because it's linked to purpose. It for me, it's linked to why I am here on this earth at this time. It's a calling. It's not a job. It's not a gig. It's not a topic. It's not a thing that we're doing. It's directly tied to, my reason for being, which is tied to my values around fairness and equality and, social justice. So, and I think that's really important. That is very important for us as practitioners, is the big why. Why am I doing this? And in doing that, you will know, is this a battle worth, is this a battle that I need to fight right now? Or is it okay for me to fade? Or it emerges in that particular way. So do I ever get tired? Yeah, there are times that I do. And the way that I kind of recuperate and recover is by taking time out, but also by reminding myself of the big why.
Thank you. What I would add to that as well is that there's lots of different ways to be courageous and to act. And we perhaps need to think about that a bit more widely. And also people have strengths in different areas as well. So we don't, or the rage doesn't have to look the same for everybody, as long as potentially we're not doing nothing. But that's the place where actually, or how would you expect change if you're not actually doing anything? You know, the status quo remains the same. So I think that's something that's really important. And that thing you just said, Carol, about purpose, that we're doing, it sounds really corny. It's like this, the greater good. I don't know. I was trying to think of a different phrase from that. But what is it that the first Black person that I ever worked with when I was teaching in a college actually died this year, I think it was. Some people might know him, Eric Pemberton. And he used to say, I'm keeping this seat warm. That's why I'm here. And so knowing that people come after you and you want to leave something that is a space that is in some way better survivable, and hopefully through some action that you may have taken with others, because we don't do this stuff on our own. That's the other thing, that we're not doing it alone. But yeah, it would be, I don't know what, I think there's times when it's not tired, we're knackered, but actually something happens and the switch goes back on and you can get up and go again. And so, yeah, there's something about being in service of something that's bigger and important. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's where my thinking goes as well. Yes. Any more? Anything we've missed? Anyone that wants to say their question as well?
We've got loads of questions actually. There's 3 which I'm going to group together. So someone has asked, we have a Prime Minister who refers to Black people as pickaninnies with watermelon smiles and talks about women being letterboxes. Can we ever have equality in these circumstances? And then some similar questions really. So how can we progress this agenda when we don't have government support? Actually, we have a government that feels hostile to it. And Anne-Marie has asked, do we need to move into a lobbying space to make change on this agenda?
I don't think we've ever had a government that's been in favour of it. I think we think that they've been in favour of things, but often it's been veiled, disguised as progress. I mean, I've been reading the chat actually, and many people have said that, you know, the moment is this, we've got a moment. Actually, I think that we need to not kid ourselves. There have been many moments, and what we have to be able to do is to press past the moment. Because we know that this is an uphill battle. I think that we get all excited with the moment, and then when the moment's gone, so are we. I think that we should be lobbying, we should be using every tool that we can, and we should be thinking more critically about the kind of political change we need, the kind of politicians we need. We've lost faith a little bit in democracy, and I see that. I see that in myself. I find it really hard to sometimes think about who I want to put my X about. But, you know, that doesn't mean that there aren't people out there that are not worthy of being part of this. So I think, we should be more politicised around this agenda, and we should be forming and strategizing in lots of different ways. I don't really, for me, it's the things that people say that I don't hear that worry me more than the things that they say in public. Yeah, if I'm really honest, at least I know the kind of person he is. But sometimes people disguise themselves in plain sight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I couldn't agree. I couldn't agree more. I mean, I don't think that we've ever had, as was said just now, as Joy said, I don't think we've ever had a government that was fully for, that definitely was anti-racist, and we have to be in that political arena. The lobbying, the kind of strategic lobbying for change needs to be consistent and not be distracted from the moment. The moment seemed to get bigger and bigger and bigger, as we've seen the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on, on Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities, the death of George Floyd. I mean, we can go on and on, but this is a bigger moment and it needs a bigger response. And that response isn't just, can't just be an emotional one. And that's why this conversation is so critical, because it's about, so who do we need to be differently? What's the toolkit? What's the strategy? What does that really need to look like? So when this big moment passes, and it's beginning to lull in some senses, you look at your Twitter feeds or your LinkedIn feeds, and we're not having as many conversations about this particular agenda. So what do we need to do to stay? And to really stay focused and deliberate becomes the big question.
Okay, thanks, Carol. Thanks. Gias, you said there were a couple more?
Yes, so there's still a lot of debate about white people's role in anti-racist practice. So there's a question around whether white allies can be trusted. What are the ethics of white people being paid to work on this agenda? And then the second broad area is around the skills that people need. So what skills do facilitators need? And Carolyn has asked, are there any kind of frameworks or audit tools that we could use to help us reflect on our behaviours and practices, which would then help us understand the direction we should be going in? So is there any kind of coaching or training that you'd recommend around how to be an anti-racist practitioner?
We're developing that as we speak.
We are developing that, actually. So so we've been working for about eight months now, 8 or 9 months, on something that's linked to process-orientated psychology, to help people to understand more about themselves and how they see themselves and how they intervene. Because I think there is this issue about, we need sharper tools in this game. So I think Carol's been doing some work on tools as well, because actually there's a clumsiness about what we're doing as equality practitioners. So we're counting, show me the audit. We're talking about impact assessments again. We're talking about the development of staff groups again. We're talking about people sitting on interview panels again. We're doing this stuff, and I think we're caught. It's almost like a snowball, and we're gathering a momentum around this, and it's just going to crash. So I think I'm really keen to think about the kind of skills that we need, and to be working in the area of that. Do you want me to go on and talk about white people in this, Carol, or do you want to pick that up?
No. I was just going to kind of really just quickly build on the skill set. We're going to be sharing with you some takeaways that begin to tap into that. As Joy said, we're equally building a framework which is all around the whole, how do you facilitate in this space in a borderless way that kind of creates the right conditions for everyone to be part of not just the conversation, but also equally of the solution, because what we have has not worked. I think that's the hard truth. That
Yeah. Do you want to say something about white facilitators, Diane? I'm putting a question to you now.
No, I'll leave that to you, because I was going to say, just move on to the skills, actually, given where we are, and there's something that's been asked about skills, because I think that the presence of white people and whiteness beats is something that really needs a bit more time, actually. Yeah, and maybe it's something for us to park temporarily. And really it would be good to,
one of the things we're often asked to do, I'm talking in terms of BRAP here, I'm sure it will be the same for you, Carol, is we're often approached by white people who want to be better at this. And we've been thinking about a boot camp, and thinking about how we can program some dates in. But at the same time, we've been working in collaboration on some frameworks for change. So we're really realizing that we need to put some of the stuff that we're learning, while also recognizing we're learning, into places that other people can access and become good at. Otherwise, we're not passing on, and we're not creating the momentum for change.
Yeah, I think the boot camp is important, but I'm equally worried about a lot of white practitioners in the space of diversity and inclusion that have focused on other areas, other dimensions, have never touched race, but who now are in the space and are doing this work. And I'm kind of really concerned about what that looks like. And so working again to think about what boot camps really need to look like, but I think that's something else we need to identify is also taking place.
It's true, and I suppose I'm going to sort of follow you off by that by saying that actually there's an issue for me about money.
Mm-hmm.
Not that I don't like it, and not that I don't spend it, but that actually it feels like there's a lot of people in this space that don't really know how to do the work, and actually the worst thing about it is that I think that people who choose people to do the work don't understand what they're choosing.
No.
So it's almost like going into a sweet shop, seeing lots of sweets, and just not being able to distinguish. And I think that we need to do something on that too. We need to help people make better choices about the practitioners that they employ to do this work, because I think there's seduction all over the place. People will go for people that say, this is really easy. All you need to do is set up a working group. All you need to do is put a black person on this panel and da-di-da-di-da. So I do think there's some real skill and deep-seated understanding in this. And we need to think about how we tussle with that too.
Okay, in a way that's digestible as well, I guess. Yeah, sorry, Diane.
So I'm going to bring us on to, I want to get to takeaways, but just a couple of things about, so we said there's some deep skill and understanding. So we're going to pin down a couple of skills, because we also said something about holding difficult conversations and looking after, if you like, all of the people that might be in your space. What would you say were some of the skills that are absolutely essential to be a practitioner in this space and for racism to fall? What are these skills that we're operationalizing?
Well, some of those are in the takeaways. So do you want us to talk about that before the takeaways?
Yeah. So let's combine those two things then.
Okay.
That's all right. So we're going to be showing something.
I'm hoping so.
Me too.
We could.
Thank you.
Thank you, Severine.
Have it.
Do you want to start on some of these, please, Carol?
Yeah. I was thinking that, well, maybe if I kind of kick off with what Diane said at the very outset, that we need to know and understand in terms of a mindset that race is a social construct. That race in and of itself does not exist, but racism does. And I think that, from our point of view, that's important. What is the mindset that you were bringing to issues of racialization, to race, and to racism? And we see it very much as that social construct, which needs to be put in its historical context as well. So that whole critical race theory becomes an important part of that. Again, equally, and an important one for us is identity and knowing who you are as an anti-racist practitioner, really owning your own identity, however you define that. But that becomes what you're rooted in, what you're absolutely grounded in, that authentic identity that is you. And I think that definition, we can have lots of conversations about what that looks like, but exploring that for yourself so that you can use yourself as a powerful instrument of change is another critical piece. Joy, do you want to speak to the purpose and why you?
I think, well, both you and Diane already spoke about this, but I do think there is an issue about how do you come to this work? Is this about a calling, or is this about making a few bucks? It links, I think, into the first things that you said, actually, because if you understand race as a social construct, and you understand and have done real work on yourself, and then you recognize that you can be an instrument of change, then you will recognize also that in that purpose is something deeper. It's something about changing humanity. It's about the stuff that is made of dreams, really. And I think there is a bit of me that feels that we need to dream that we can be in a better world, and that we're part of making that.
So another thing we thought we would share is that doing your own work, right? And knowing, you know, really knowing what your triggers are and what your push buttons are, and, you know, yeah, what they look like, and being able to recover from that, notice and recover from that. But you can't do this work if you haven't worked on yourself, and that is a continuous process. Passion, you know, having a passion for this is not enough when you're in a room and you are shut down, or you're challenged, or you don't quite know how to manage yourself when you are, you know, when your back's against the wall. So knowing what those triggers are and being able to manage those triggers, but also to use them, right, to really draw on those triggers to inform the conversation is I think is equally, we think is equally important.
I think the thing about change leader or follower links to this idea of deconstruction. So if we are recognizing race as a social construct, to what degree then are you enabling race to live through your work, and the idea of different races to live through your work, and the idea of you know, trying to deal with the symptoms of racism rather than the causes. So lots of things that we're doing are dealing with the symptoms. I'm not saying that it's not important to deal with the symptoms. You know, people are suffering, people are hurting out there, but you cannot be a sharp interventionist in this area if you don't recognize the difference between doing something that impacts deeply on the system and our society, or doing things that just massage what's already going on. So knowing the difference between whether you're leading this or you're following it is really critical.
Yeah. And then I think, and on that, I mean, coming back to the seduction, you know, that whole seduction piece, it's much easier to stay in the comfort zone of massaging what already exists in terms of the broader system. And that's why that system thinking, you know, being able to join the dots between the lived experiences of, let's say, Black people in a particular organization, and the processes and the procedures and the policies and the various parts of the organization, and how those different parts of the organization are interconnected. Understanding the big strategic picture is, again, another fundamental part. And so we hear a lot, and we know that a lot of diversity and inclusion practitioners emerge from HR. But HR is one part of the system, and it's one part of the system that, in some senses, quite often has been institutionalized in a particular way, and also represent the majority system. So being able to make those connections and think strategically is important too.
Do you want to do facilitation, Cara?
Yeah, so, you know, in terms of facilitation, having a toolkit that you can draw on, and a broad toolkit, a deep toolkit, a varied toolkit. So between Joy and I, we were, you know, from process work that you've heard Joy talk about, to that strategic thinking that you've heard me talk about, to emotional intelligence toolkits, to leadership toolkits and frameworks, all of those behave, because it is fundamentally about changing behaviors. I don't think, I mean, I have such a passion for this calling, because you know, you learn and have to know, yeah, quite a lot. So it's fairly extensive and deep, and being able to kind of have that toolkit and use it specifically in particular instances, and knowing what to use and when is important.
I think the thing that has been that's harder to sit with is not being liked and being comfortable with discomfort. So, you know, lots of people through the track have talked about the pushback, have talked about the backlash. This work does not really make you very popular. It can make you unpopular. It can make you unpopular with people who are racialized as white, as well as people who are racialized as black. You don't win any friends doing this work, I don't think, for very, sometimes, you know, people stay with you for a very long time, but you have to be comfortable with the discomfort because there's purpose in it. You're not doing it to be horrible. You're doing it because there is something else that you're trying to do in service of the world, and finding places then to remember who you are, and to rest and to recuperate and to laugh. I mean, I didn't talk about laughter because it feels sometimes a little bit perverse to do so, but actually this can be such a heavy space to be in. It's really important that there are ways in which you can replenish yourself. Sometimes when I was doing this in my early 20s, I used to come home from doing a session where I'd be hearing all of this stuff, and I'd just have to go into the shower for about 10 minutes to normalize, to just recognize that I could be human again. So I think rest and recuperation and trying to fill your life with other things that give you balance and center you are really important when you're doing this stuff.
Absolutely, you know, absolutely. And that kind of brings us to the last, but I think one of the most important bits for us, which is about, you know, your self-leadership, and humility is a big one. So, you know, as practitioners in this space, we don't know everything. There is a perspective that we might have, but it doesn't necessarily provide all of the answers to everyone. And I think sometimes there's a righteous indignation we can have as activists, and there's got to be a place where you know, we let go, and we can see things from different, being okay with that. And importantly, that we bring hope, faith, and belief, and hope that things can be different, that the world must change, and we're able to, I love the word that you use there, Joy, about being able to imagine again and dream and see a different world, and from that place begin to articulate that and hold on to that in those moments, you know, when your back is against the wall, and you know, when stuff hits the fan and so on. But that's what leadership is very much about. And you wouldn't be on this call, or you wouldn't be participating rather in this exercise today, or part of this conversation, if you weren't called to do it. And that's what we kind of fundamentally believe too. So these are our takeaways for you to take away. And I think, you know, to be fair, we've just touched the surface on each and every one of them. They could be a conversation in their own right, but wanted to give you something to walk away with and to reflect, to deeply kind of reflect upon and build up yourself.
Thanks, Carol.
So I think we should be considering how we're going to release people. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we've got the Equality Republic events calendar to show. So before we go, yeah, do you want to close it down, Zara? Okay.
So I suppose our final comments. I mean, as I'm listening to this, one of the things that some of the messages we want people to hear in terms of racism must fall is, one, we think it can fall, we think things can be different, we think things can change, but we're also recognizing that there's loads of work to do, and it's hard, and there's as much forward. There's a whole range of people I find it very hard not to step back from certain things as well. But this is a journey that we're in. There's a feeling of it having to be, because we want this difference, this change in the world so badly as well. And all of the people that I've worked with in relation to being around, you know, who come into BRAC and work with us, that's what I found, that we have to, you know, we're compelled to. And so that's what this is a space that we're trying to occupy with this Equality Republic, that we're trying to create a movement that does something different, and something different from what we're normally doing, not just to play with different, but to change and to make some things happen. So I hope that we get you in a space where you want to keep talking, and you want to keep chewing over this stuff and really taking it apart, etc. And that we're helping you with some of that in terms of our conversation with each other. Okay, so
thanks, Di. Yeah.
Do you want to share the final?
Yeah, so we wanted to talk to you about just the Republic calendar event. So before we do that, I really want to thank Carol for taking time out of her busy day to come and talk to us about this. And I find Carol extremely impressive. And not only because she says impressive things, but because she does impressive things, and she recognises as well that we're on a learning journey. So she doesn't ever say, I'm done yet, I'm finished yet. And she's really willing to listen and learn. So I'm really grateful that Carol has agreed to be someone who can help us to shape and form the Equality Republic movement. Also wanted to thank Diane, after a long day facilitation on Zoom, who's come on to help to facilitate this, and lots of people in the background who have been technical and questions and chat and helping to keep things going, including Severin. And thank you to you, because you've come here. You've stayed with us, and you're prepared to listen and engage with us. It's not the easiest tool to use, but I think it's been fantastic in terms of being able to connect people from all over the place and to keep some of these conversations going, which I think at very low cost we've been able to do some of this stuff. So let me just tell you a little bit about what's coming up next. So I'm going to ask my colleague Severin if she could share this. So we are going to be running, and this is through an offer from a very skilled but very humble equality practitioner in Scotland, who's a member of the public, who's actually running some equality, diversity and inclusion action learning sets, so that we can help to explore and learn, and to value that process of learning and reflection and collaboration. So I think we've already got some people signed up to that. We've got an equality saloon where we're going to be talking more to you. It's a very small event about your equality issues, challenges, and almost like having a bit of a question and answer session, but directly. We've got a question on intersectionality that Diane Atiloongo is running. Have I said that right, Carol? Say that word for me.
It's okay, Joy.
I love to be corrected, you know I do. So Diane's going to be running that with us in December. There's an opportunity for you to think about any topics that you would like. So if you're members of the Republic, please email us. Please say, you know, actually, I'd really like to know a bit more about this, or can we do an event on X or Y? We're talking in March about running an event to look at how we bring in senior leaders. So senior leaders are the ones that, you know, are they the ones that are the blockage, or could we be doing more to get senior leaders on board with the equalities agenda? And then in April, we're looking at whiteness again. So we can send that out if you're a Equality Republic member. Don't forget, it doesn't cost anything to be member. This is about a social movement, and don't forget, you can be more active in the movement. So Amanda's generous offer, for example, of facilitating some practitioner action learning sets. So if you have offers, this is how the Republic's going to grow. This is how we're going to learn and work together. So please don't forget, you can be participative in this agenda. You don't just have to sit there and watch us on stage a little bit. So it's 5:02. I don't know, Carol, if you've got anything closing to say? Or
this has been, actually, for me, it's been a really rich, rewarding, stretching, and challenging kind of conversation. It's really got me thinking once again about, you know, my practice, and just again in terms of the need. And I think that we talk about this moment, let's join hands, let's work together to make sure that this isn't a moment, but is a forever time. I probably haven't said that right, but that's kind of where I feel. I think we got the opportunity to do that. So thank you so much, Joy, Diane, everyone from BRAT, for trusting me to have this conversation with you. It's been a privilege.
Thank you very much, Carol and Joy and the BRAT team, and all of you for sticking with us when it starts, because it's getting dark early as well, so it's weird. But thank you very much, everybody.